Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to AP US History, as we look today at the presidency of George W. Bush. Because in the year 2000, George W. Bush, son of former President George H.W. Bush, ran for president against Bill Clinton's vice president, Al Gore Jr., a former senator from Tennessee. Bush claimed that he would restore dignity and morality to the office of the presidency. Indeed, Gore was hurt, among many conservatives, by the moral scandals of Clinton's presidency. But he also alienated liberals by distancing himself from Clinton, who was still popular with many Americans. And the election of 2000 was very close, ultimately being decided by the state of Florida. Because in Florida, the election was so close that in some counties it came down to a few hundred votes, and some of those counties ordered a recount. Overall, about 70,000 votes were disputed, and many had to be recounted by hand. And this took a long time. The election determination dragging on through the month of November. People tuned into the news to see who would win. And in the past, the colors of the parties represented on electoral maps had been chosen at random. Republicans were sometimes red, sometimes blue, the Democrats the reverse. Indeed, no party was considered red in particular because that was the color of communism, and who would want to be a red party? But it happened that several of the major news programs had chosen red to represent the Republican Party and blue to represent the Democrats in the year 2000. And ever since, red and blue have come to symbolize those two parties in the United States. As the recount dragged on, it eventually went to the Supreme Court, where in the case of Bush versus Gore, the Supreme Court decided in a 5-4 decision to stop the recount and allow Florida to certify the victory to George W. Bush, brother of the governor of Florida, Jeb Bush, making Bush the winner officially by 537 votes. At the time, many people viewed this as the Supreme Court deciding the election. And it did happen that the 5-4 decision was based, it seemed, on which party's president had nominated each of the Supreme Court justices. Many Democrats blamed the loss on other issues too, including mistakes made by voters, confused by the so-called butterfly ballot used by Florida in that election. And to be sure, Pat Buchanan, a third-party candidate who had once said the U.S. should have sided with Hitler rather than the Soviet Union in World War II because communism was so terrible, got a lot higher percentage of votes in heavily Jewish counties than one might have suspected. A man who had spoken somewhat favorably of Hitler might have gotten. Also, Ralph Nader, running for the Green Party, received 97,488 votes, which probably would have gone to Al Gore for the most part had Nader not been running. And so he was blamed by some for Gore's loss of the election. But even though the recount was stopped, a number of non-binding recounts were held later, using different standards for counting ballots, and under most of them, Bush still won the election. And Bush's presidency would see a number of crises. The first of these was the bursting of the dot-com bubble, when stocks of internet-based companies that people had invested in because the internet was so exciting and so full of possibilities came to be seen as based on excessive speculation, many of those companies turning no real profit. And the value of many of those stocks crashed in April of 2001, beginning a recession in the United States. Now, the internet was a product of the space race, as ARPA, the Advanced Research Projects Agency created by Dwight Eisenhower in 1958, had looked for a way to decentralize and share the country's computing power, both to make the most of the resources that different research labs had, and so the entire country's computer network would not be destroyed in the event of a nuclear strike taking out one important computer. Over years of research, computers were connected as ARPAnet, the first two being connected October 29th, 1969, and this is often seen as the beginning of the internet. So the internet keeps us safe from the communists. For years, the internet was used mostly by military researchers and university researchers, but as time passed, other students and professors began to use it for communication through electronic mail, chat, and message boards. Some primitive text-based games were even created. Still, the internet did not spread much beyond specialized users until the creation of the first web browser in 1990. Allowing web pages, at first still just text, but soon including some pictures and even music, to be hyperlinked to each other. So one could click on a hyperlink and be taken directly to another web page, thus creating the World Wide Web, which is not the entire internet, but most of it, consisting of all the computers that are linked together. And this made it much easier to navigate the internet. One no longer had to type in sometimes confusing or esoteric commands to your computer. One could use the mouse to navigate the internet. Furthermore, the rise of online services for mass consumers in the 1980s, such as CompuServe, and especially America Online in the early 1990s, allowed more and more people access to the internet. At first, most such services limited their users to their own programs and message boards, sometimes even email. So sometimes you could only email somebody else on the same service, sometimes described as a walled garden. America Online first began letting its members connect to other services in September of 1993, truly opening the internet up to everyone. Getting the first web browser with a truly graphical interface, not just typing, was released in 1993, in making the World Wide Web even more accessible. Of course, all this was possible because of the appearance of the personal computer in the 1970s, a computer you could have on your desktop and not be linked to a massive mainframe in some university lab somewhere. And soon the market for PCs was dominated by two companies, and really at first two men, Bill Gates, who had founded Microsoft, and Steve Jobs, one of the two founders of Apple Computers. In 1984, Apple Computer released the Macintosh, the first computer to have a graphical user interface, meaning you could use your mouse to click on images on the computer to get to programs rather than having to type every command by hand. This was later copied by Microsoft Windows in 1990. In the 1990s, Microsoft dominated the personal computer market, eventually becoming the focus of anti-monopoly lawsuits in 1998. Apple's dominance declined in the late 1980s and certainly 1990s until Steve Jobs, who had been forced out of the company, returned in the late 1990s and helped the company return to its roots of creating stylish and easy-to-use computers, such as the iMac in 1998, and other devices like the iPod in 2001, the iPhone in 2007, and the iPad in 2010, putting the internet quite literally in the hands of anyone who could afford it. In many ways creating the internet as we think of it today. So by the year 2000, about half of Americans use the internet. Online shopping, such as through eBay, had become a big part of the economy. Credit for this does go in part to eBay, but is often given to Jeff Bezos, who founded Amazon.com in 1995. At first as an online bookstore, books being something very easy to sell online, knowing the title and the author of the book, and possibly reviews is all you really need to know. It's not something you need to pick up and handle and carefully examine. Books are also very straightforward to ship. Later, of course, Amazon expanded to sell many, many more products and even create products of their own. And Amazon was one of the major companies to survive the dot-com crash of 2001, is today by far the largest online retailer in America. And this ease of storing and sharing information on computers, and especially the internet, created an information revolution in America and around the world. The second, and perhaps defining crisis of Bush's presidency, was the terrorist attack on September 11th, 2001. In 2001, Osama bin Ladin and the fundamentalist group he led, al-Quaeda, carried out the September 11th attacks on the United States. These attacks killed 2,986 people and destroyed the World Trade Center Twin Towers in New York City, damaged the Pentagon, and involved the crash of a fourth plane when passengers on the plane began hearing on their cell phones about the hijacking of other planes and their use as human-guided missiles. The passengers on that plane fought back against the terrorists, causing the plane to crash in a field in Pennsylvania, killing everyone aboard, but saving some much larger target from another terrorist attack. So this was an attack on the United States, and the United States is a member of NATO. So an attack on one member is an attack on every member. And NATO, therefore, invaded Afghanistan, according in part to what came to be known as the Bush Doctrine, a promise by George Bush to treat any country that harbored terrorists as if it itself launched the attacks by the terrorists. And Afghanistan's government, the Taliban, a former Mujahideen group, certainly supported al-Qaeda. And so Afghanistan was invaded by NATO, a war that was quick and successful, at least in terms of throwing the Taliban out of power. But occupying Afghanistan has been much, much harder. Indeed, the initial success seemed so great that Afghanistan soon came to be ignored, at least to some degree, in favor of other military commitments that developed under the presidency of George Bush. Many local warlords remained powerful in Afghanistan, sometimes funding their activities through the opium trade. And the Taliban has remained in control of some parts of Afghanistan and continues to fight against the elected Afghan government, the U.S., and what few other NATO forces remain in Afghanistan. And the government created by the U.S. and our allies is often corrupt, and politics tend to be based on tribal loyalties and the spoils system. To try to detect future terrorist activities, in October of 2001, Congress passed the PATRIOT Act, allowing increased government surveillance of telephone, email, and financial records without a court order, or rather, orders could be reached by special secret courts. It permitted certain types of searches without a warrant and indefinite detention of non-citizens suspected of planning terrorist activities. And starting in 2002, some suspected terrorists viewed as particularly dangerous, but without necessarily the evidence to prosecute them in a standard court of law in America, began to be imprisoned in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, a military base leased from Cuba by the United States since the Spanish-American War. And, as we know from the insular cases of the early 20th century, the Constitution does not follow the flag. The same legal procedures that might apply to such prisoners in the U.S. do not necessarily apply in Guantanamo Bay. There have been many accusations of mistreatment of prisoners there. Under President Obama, many of the prisoners were transferred to other facilities, but some still remain. In 2003, the United States began concern that Iraq might have aided al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups. And certainly throughout the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, many Middle Eastern countries had supported training camps for terrorists or otherwise actively sponsored terror. Libya and Syria were particularly infamous for that. But the government of Iraq under Saddam Hussein had sometimes supported terrorist activity as well, although not that of Osama bin Ladin, Osama bin Ladin, as a religious fundamentalist, despised Saddam Hussein for being a secular rather than religious leader, who for much of his rule tried to limit the influence of religious leaders in Iraq. After the Gulf War, he became friendlier to religious leaders, hoping they would maintain support for him. But that was more a political than a spiritual motive on his part. And so he was not popular with Osama bin Laden or many other fundamentalists. And there were fears, too, that Iraq was continuing its programs to create weapons of mass destruction, particularly biological and chemical weapons, which they had worked on in years past and certainly had before and during the first Gulf War. They were supposed to destroy all such weapons after the Gulf War and permit the United Nations to inspect the country. But as inspections continued in the early 21st century, Saddam Hussein placed a number of sites off limits to inspectors, and evidence seemed to appear that some weapons of mass destruction, chemical weapons in particular, were being stored in Iraq. Although in fact, after Iraq was invaded by the United States and some other allies, a coalition of the willing, such weapons of mass destruction were never in fact found. But in March of 2003, American, British, and other troops invaded Iraq. Operation Iraqi Freedom rapidly overthrew Saddam Hussein, who went into hiding but was eventually found and executed. And this attempt at regime change, like the overthrow of the Taliban in Afghanistan, was supported by a group known as the Neoconservatives, or Neocons, who had a philosophy dating to the Vietnam War era, and arguably developing from earlier ideas such as Wilson's moral diplomacy or even the Whig theory of history that the world naturally trends towards democracy. They believed, these neocons, that with sufficient help from outsiders like the United States, dictatorships could develop into democracies, and that indeed the United States had a duty to try to bring peace through strength to oppressed peoples. If the United States could overthrow dictators around the world, we could guide those countries to democracy, which people in their hearts naturally want. And following the military victory over Saddam Hussein, the U.S. did help to create a democratic government in Iraq, although one that has certainly had its share of problems. In particular, democracy has sometimes permitted the tyranny of the majority, as some groups in Iraq have tried to limit the rights of others. Furthermore, after the invasion of Iraq, some countries began to criticize the U.S. France, in particular, doubted the justification for this invasion, and indeed, evidence for weapons of mass destruction turned out to be apparently faulty. So as France and other countries criticized the United States became defensive. In the U.S., for example, French fries were renamed, even on the official congressional menu, as freedom fries. French's Mustard issued a press statement saying that the only thing French about them was their name. And it is true that after the U.S. invasion of Iraq, al-Quaeda, who had largely been absent from Iraq, became increasingly involved in the area. And this was partly because once democracy was allowed in Iraq, the Shia Arabs, who made up the largest group in Iraq, elected the majority of the leaders and often favored their own religious group, particularly discriminating against the Sunni Arabs, who had previously run Iraq since its independence from the Ottoman Empire. Of course, under the Ottoman Empire, Sunni Muslims had also been favored. Many Sunni Muslims, or at least Sunni Arabs in Iraq who had previously been opposed to al-Qaeda, now came to support them and engage in freelance terrorism too, against a government and a foreign occupation that seemed to oppress them. On the other hand, Kurds, a different ethnic group, mostly Sunni Muslim, found in northern Iraq, were mostly left alone and developed a relatively stable and prosperous society. To such an extent, they eventually sought independence from Iraq, but were prevented from doing so. But in general have remained a good ally of the U.S. in the Middle East. In 2007, in response to growing terrorist activity, President Bush announced a troop surge in Iraq, vastly increasing the number of American troops there, both to support local leaders willing to work with America, a number that grew as they saw their support would be protected by Americans. Furthermore, around this time, many countries who had supported the U.S. invasion of Iraq, perhaps Britain being the most important, were withdrawing their troops. During the troop surge, as the U.S. military worked more closely with some local Sunni leaders, a vast reduction in violence in Iraq was achieved. And that reduction in violence, along with American weariness of the war and a change of administration in the election of Barack Obama, and finally the request of the Iraqi government, led to the withdrawal of almost all American troops from Iraq in 2011. Now, one thing that made the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq different from the Vietnam War, our most recent, really large war before this, and indeed from other 20th century wars, or most of them, was there was no draft. Among other things, the absence of a draft meant a much heavier reliance on the National Guard. During the Vietnam War, the National Guard had been kept at home, although many had been sent overseas during World War I and World War II, and some in Korea. And the absence of a draft and also the absence of rationing or even major tax increases meant that while the war was going on, it really didn't touch the lives of the average American that much, allowing many to eventually kind of forget about the war, but placing a lot of pressure on National Guardsmen and regular Army soldiers who might be stationed overseas for a long time or sent back to the Middle East on multiple missions. The third crisis of President Bush's administration came very early in his second term, when in August of 2005, Hurricane Katrina hit the Gulf Coast, particularly New Orleans, which was almost entirely flooded, as most of the city is actually below sea level. This was the most destructive hurricane in American history to that point in terms of property damage, although in terms of loss of life, the Galveston hurricane of the early 20th century was much worse. And since then, Hurricane Harvey of 2017 approximately equaled Katrina in terms of property damage, but this was a very traumatic event for the United States. Local governments did not handle the hurricane very well in its early days, and the federal government seemed slow to respond to the crisis too, causing a significant criticism of President Bush's administration and suggestions that President Bush did not really care about the people of the Gulf Coast, particularly the predominantly black New Orleans. Many American oil refineries and ports through which oil is imported are located on the Gulf Coast, and Hurricane Katrina shut many of these down, leading to some brief gas shortages and a significant and long-lasting increase in gas prices, which rose to over $4 a gallon in some places from having been not much over $1 a couple of years before. At the worst point during this gas price increase, the percentage of people's income they were spending on gas was even greater than during the oil crisis of the early 1970s. And these increased fuel costs hurt the economy, contributing in at least a small way to the financial problems that would strike the country a few years later. As the final crisis of Bush's presidency came in 2007 and 2008, when the economy crashed in what was the worst recession since the Great Depression. But this had roots going back over a decade. In 1992, a Democratic Congress passed and Republican President George Bush signed a law requiring Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, two technically independent but government-backed mortgage companies, to begin making more loans to low-income borrowers, even if that involved making loans to people who were higher credit risks. And this practice of giving loans to higher risk individuals increased under the presidency of Bill Clinton, a Democrat, although it was supported by a Republican Congress. The idea being that home ownership gives people a greater stake in society, allows them to build a long-term investment in their home. Furthermore, in 1999, President Clinton and Congress repealed parts of the Glass-Steagall Act, which allowed single financial institutions to again take part in retail banking, investment banking, and insurance, functions which had been split into separate companies in 1933 as part of the New Deal. Pretty soon, large banks began expanding into different types of banking or merging with other banks so they could do so. In bringing retail banking, investment banking, and insurance under one roof for many big banks. Furthermore, during the good economic times of the late 1990s and early 2000s, many banks began lowering requirements to get a credit card. So credit card use became much more widespread. Many banks, too, began making it much easier to get a home loan, giving loans to people with bad credit, known as subprime loans. Many banks, too, began requiring lower down payments for new homes. In the past, 20 or at least 15% down payments had been common, but in the early 21st century, many banks would accept a 10% down payment or a 5% down payment. Some require no money down. Some would even offer a 103% loan, lending a buyer more than the purchase price of the house in order to cover the closing costs as well. As it became easier to buy a house, more and more people bought them, and housing prices went up. As house prices increased, some people took out additional mortgages against houses which were now worth much more than they had paid for them. Banks were not too worried, as many of them were able to sell these subprime loans that they had made in large groups of loans to investment banks, while also insuring those blocks of loans against their collapse. However, as more and more investment banks began speculating in home loans, it began to hurt them as people with poor credit began to have trouble paying off those loans. And that speculation began to hurt banks as more and more homes went into foreclosure starting around the year 2006. House prices began to fall. People found they owed more on their houses than houses were now worth on paper. This was described as being underwater. Banks became reluctant to lend money, understandably, so that by 2007, credit had largely dried up. In 2008, Lehman Brothers, the fourth largest bank in the United States at that time, weighed down by subprime mortgages, declared bankruptcy. And this is often considered the start of the Great Recession, although house prices had been falling for a year or two by that point. The U.S. government did not do much for Lehman Brothers, but they were worried that more banks would fail and bring down the entire economy. And so they began lending money to major banks in a so-called bank bailout to important banks described as too big to fail. However, very little was done to help individuals hurt by the recession, leading to a backlash against the government that was eventually organized, at least in part, as the Tea Party movement, which at first was simply an anger at the government helping big banks and not helping individuals, but grew into a much larger movement, primarily demanding a very limited government. Under President Bush and later President Obama, the U.S. government undertook two stimulus programs. Under Bush, individual and business taxes were cut, and money was lent to banks, and bad loans were bought from banks under the Troubled Assets Relief Program, or TARP, and to help keep banks going. Indeed, banks did, for the most part, eventually pay those loans back with interest, but it was very unpopular at the time. President Obama continued that program and also bailed out not just the banks, but General Motors and Chrysler, and spent money on infrastructure and other projects. Economists remain divided on how helpful either stimulus plan was. Certainly, it put the country much deeper into debt. In 2010, Congress passed the Dodd-Frank Act to regulate banks much more strictly, although its rules were relaxed somewhat in 2018. The overall collapse of the economy, of course, led to rising unemployment, reaching a peak of 10.1% in October of 2009, the worst since the Great Depression, although unemployment would again spike in 2020, briefly hitting 14.7% in April of that year. The unemployment rate was particularly noticeable among men in low-skilled jobs such as manufacturing and construction. Indeed, at one point during the Great Recession, more women were employed than men for the first time in U.S. history. The Great Recession in the United States officially ran from September of 2007 to June of 2009 based on the overall growth rates of the economy. But since the recession officially ended, wage growth has still been very low in many industries. Income inequality has grown. As most income growth has been in jobs requiring high levels of education or good business connections. Median household wealth fell 35% in the United States, from a median household wealth of $106,591 in 2005 to a low of $68,839 in 2011, taking years to recover. Even 2016, median household wealth had recovered just to $97,000, not making it to $121,000 until 2019. So the recovery for many people has been very slow and uneven. In 2008, George Bush had served 2 terms, and so the Republicans nominated Vietnam veteran John McCain and the second female vice presidential candidate, Sarah Palin, governor of Alaska. The Democrats nominated Barack Obama, a young black senator from Illinois, and of course the first black man to run for the presidency with a major party. His vice presidential candidate was Joe Biden, a long-serving senator from Delaware. And to a country tired of Bush's wars and the Great Recession, he promised hope and change.